the 18th century, exploration of Australia's vast interior was all the go. Explorers were heroic figures, the astronauts of their age. A lot of the brave explorers who crisscrossed this vast land are now justifiably famous here in Australia. But there's one man who opened up huge tracts of South Australia, including what's now its most successful wine-growing area. But that's not what made him famous at all. He's celebrated for something entirely different. He was the first man in history to be shot by his own camel. John Horrocks arrived in Australia on his 21st birthday, carrying a burning desire to make his mark on the colony. The young gent made a good fist of farming, but soon decided exploring was more to his nature. For that purpose, he imported Harry, the very first camel to arrive in Australia. Now, I know a lot of camels are really sweet-tempered, but Harry was a bit of a monster. The first thing he did was bite the head of the chief tent man called Garlic, and there were two huge gashes in Garlic's forehead and one down his cheek. Then Harry bit one of the goats, shook him by the scruff of its neck and apparently tried to eat it, and then finally he took a bite out of the flour bag. And of course that caused a great big trail of white all the way behind them and used up a lot of valuable supplies. Now, all that might sound like a bit of comedy, but then things got much darker. Horrocks, up ahead, saw a sweet little bird and thought, oh, this is going to look great for my stuffed bird collection. So he went to get his gun, and at that moment, Harry lurched or something, and the gun went off, and it went right through Horrocks' hand, knocking off all his right fingers, then through his cheek, and knocked all his teeth out. When he was shot, young Horrocks was just 3 days into his grand adventure. A week after that, he dictated what would be his final recorded words. They read, "It is with the greatest regret I have to inform the committee and my fellow colonists who subscribed towards the expenses of the expedition of its untimely and unfortunate termination." A very polite, dare I say typically British way of saying, I've been shot, so the trip's off. Horrocks contracted gangrene and died 23 days later. But before he passed away, he ordered that the camel should be shot. It took 2 bullets to kill Harry, and only after he'd managed to take one final bite out of a stockman's head. The vast interior of Australia was still a mystery when Horrocks' luck ran out. In fact, no European laid eyes on the red centre of Australia until more than 50 years after the British set up their little settlement in Sydney. The reason was these, the Blue Mountains. For decades, Sydney was landlocked. What lay beyond these rock escarpments was just speculation and guesswork. There was an insatiable demand for wool in the early 1800s. Anyone in the colony who could get wool to England's great textile mills was virtually guaranteed instant wealth. So the motivation to find more farming land was pretty strong. The mountains were finally crossed in 1813 by explorers who followed Aboriginal trails along the ridges. They were a hardy bunch, the early explorers, but some of them stood out. Thomas Mitchell arrived 15 years after the Blue Mountains were crossed. He believed all the good farming land had already been discovered. More than anything, he wanted to make his mark as an explorer and felt frustrated to be put on surveying duty. But ironically, it was his surveying skills that led him to finally achieve his goal. Apollo and I are going to give you a bit of a demonstration of surveying because Mitchell had this really curious way of working out how far he'd travelled during the course of the day. And he did it using these things, broad beans. He'd stick them in his pocket and then he'd count the steps that his horse made, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, till he got to 100. When he got to 100, he'd put a bean into his pocket, then he'd start again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, until he got to another 100, pop another bean into his pocket, and he reckoned that his horse took 950 steps to go 1 mile. So at the end of the day, if he'd got 100 beans in his pocket, then he knew that his horse had travelled about 10.5 miles. Now, that may not be as accurate as GPS, but quite frankly, Mitchell is the most famous surveyor in Australia, so who am I to argue? Who are you to argue either? Have some more beans. Doesn't want any more beans. Mitchell was asked to use his surveying skills to chart the Darling River in the west of New South Wales. But his ambition got the better of him. He saw there was much more promising land to the south of the Murray River and decided to set off into uncharted territory. And he hit the jackpot, open pasture land as far as the eye could see. He called it Australia Felix, lucky Australia. And it was lucky for him too. As one of the very few explorers to discover rich pasture land, Mitchell's place in Australian history was assured. Mitchell and his team had crossed mountains, navigated rivers and slept rough in the bush. By the time they got to Portland on the south coast of Victoria, they'd been on the move for 5 months. They were miles away from civilization in previously uncharted territory. Except, actually, they weren't. Imagine Mitchell's surprise. He'd stumbled onto an established settlement that no one else in the colony knew existed. A farming family from West Sussex called the Hentys had slipped through the back door with a land grant from the King of England.
Tony, hi, come on in.
Thank you. How long had the Hentys been in Australia?
They'd been in Portland for 18 months before Major Mitchell arrived. So they had their huts built and their veggie garden and their trees and they had a very good establishment. They had their cattle, they had their horses, they had a lot of stock over here.
So what happened when Mitchell showed up at the Hentys' place?
Well, they thought they were bushrangers because they didn't know there was no white men for miles around.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden this white man was coming through the bush at them, with guns and feathers in their caps and all sorts of things, and they went, well, this must be a bushranger, so we'll load the gun.
Could it have been one of these old guns?
Yeah, well, this gun here is Francis Henty shotgun. So that's dated around about 1810. It's the first shotgun in Victoria. Edward Henty, in his recollection of the meeting, actually says that the old gun was loaded to the breech to make sure he gave the bushrangers a warm reception.
So the meeting is on record?
Yes, it is. This is a document written by Edward Henty. And what he goes on to say is that the appearance of Major Mitchell and his band of 5 with emu feathers in their caps, as well as the red tail feathers of the black cockatoo, blue and red serge shirts, and much tattered, patched and worn, and certainly very fierce and formidable looking.
They just looked absolutely terrifying,
That would have been horrible. An explanation and reconciliation followed. So that's when they went, oh, well, we won't shoot him yet, we'll find out what he's about. Mitchell arrived without anything because they'd run out of flour and all those sorts of things. So the Henty said, well, we've got a supply ship turning up in a day. We'll wait until that comes and then we can load you up. So they gave them flour and gin and whole heaps of grog and stuff. So they sent them off their way after about 3 or 4 days.
Now, Major Mitchell must have been grateful because he tipped off the Hentys about the fertile lands that he'd found to the north, and that helped make them rich. But when he got back to Sydney, he reported the presence of the squatter clan to his boss, the new governor of New South Wales, and it didn't do well for the Hentys. So what did Governor Gibbs do?
Well, he set down a team, because he went right off the rocker, apparently. He went, oh, what's everybody, what are they doing down there?
Big landowners in my land.
What's happening? That damn king, what's he doing? I'm trying to run this show. So he set down a surveyor and stuff. And, of course, the Hentys had laid out their houses and their gardens and everything else. And just to really make the point to the Hentys, right, that Gibbs was actually the boss, they actually put a road right through Edward Henty's middle of his house.
You know what?
which was very nice.
I think the Henties would have been much better off if they'd shot Mitchell.
They were very British at that stage.
Actually, you're a Hentie, aren't you? I think I'll just put that down and move to the other side of the room. When I first heard the story about Mitchell meeting the Henty brothers, I assumed that the Henties were a pair of ragamuffins trading with whalers and making a hand-to-mouth living. I now realise that they were landowners, they were favoured by the King of England and were very, very respectable. Look, this is Francis Henty's own top hat. I better give it back before I go.
Thousands of hopeful squatters followed pioneers like the Henties whenever news of new pasture lands reached Sydney. Usually with nothing more than a few head of sheep and a plan to get rich quick. They were rapidly spreading out across the country, each new run a few kilometres further into the interior than the last. By the end of the 1840s, sheep runs covered much of eastern Australia. But of course the land wasn't vacant. Some Aborigines accepted the squatters, but there were others who resented their arrival and decided to fight back. As the sheep moved out across the country, so did the violence. In places like Tasmania, there was armed resistance. Aborigines, angered by the takeover of their lands, waged a kind of guerrilla war. Retaliation from the squatters was often brutal and excessive.
This little painted board is really rare, which is why I'm wearing the white gloves. And it's a proclamation from a Lieutenant Governor in Tasmania in the early 19th century, and it's addressed to the Aboriginals. That's why there's this little hole here, so that it can be tied to trees out in the bush. And it's like a cartoon. In the top frame, you've got black people and white people together living in perfect harmony, like in the song by Paul McCartney and Stevie Wonder. Two little children there holding hands. You've got a black baby there and a white baby there. Maybe it's even implying into marriage, I don't know. And then in the frame below, you've got the top brass of both the Aboriginals and the colonists shaking hands. But then, in the next frame, you can see that if a black person kills a white person, then the black gets hung, and likewise, if a white person kills a black person, then the white person gets hung, which all seems pretty fair and dandy, except it's not really a very good representation of the truth.
In fact, no white person was hanged anywhere in Australia for killing a black person in the first 50 years of the colony, despite the fact that thousands of Aboriginals were murdered in those years.
On June the 10th, 1838, a posse of white men rode into Mile Creek Cattle Station, saying that they were looking for some Aboriginals who'd been rustling cattle. Now, there were Aboriginals on that station, but they were known to be mild and inoffensive. They clearly hadn't had anything to do with any cattle theft. Nevertheless, the posse rounded them up.
These men were mostly ex-convicts employed as stockmen in this remote part of northwestern New South Wales. No doubt they thought they could get away with the massacre because some of them had been involved in wholesale murder of Aboriginals before and hadn't been brought to justice.
The posse had tied up all 28 Aboriginals into a kind of human ball, 28 terrified men, women and children, and then they dragged them out into the countryside and wandered round with them for about an hour in a pretty ineffectual way, as though they didn't really know what they were going to do next. But then they must have had some kind of change of heart, because all 28 Aboriginals were murdered. Terrible things were done to them. Most of the children were decapitated. The adults were hacked to death and burned. Then the posse rode back to Mile Creek, had their breakfast, and boasted about what they'd done.
Eventually, the men were rounded up and charged with murder. But arresting them was one thing. Convicting them would be the real test of justice. When the Mile Creek Massacre came to trial, the judge reminded the jury that there was no difference in law between killing a white man and killing a black man. Nevertheless, it took the jury just 20 minutes to find all 11 defendants not guilty, at which point cheers broke out in the courtroom. The mood of the times was that no white man should be hung for killing a black man. But times were about to change. Governor Gibbs took the unprecedented step of ordering a second trial. This time around, justice was served. 7 of the 11 accused were hanged for murder. It may not have been the last massacre of Aboriginal people in Australia, but the trial was a turning point for the treatment of Aboriginal people under British law. It's a subject that's close to the heart of historian Eric Wilmot. What do you think the significance of the Mile Creek judgment was?
The significance was it represented a complete change in the attitude of Europeans, the colonisers, to the indigenous people of Australia.
So as far as you're concerned, the verdict and the way the verdict was implemented were a huge change in Australian history.
Yeah, the first change was that these people were human. And if you killed them, you could be charged with murder, which is what happened, and be executed for it. That was fantastically important.
The Aboriginals who worked at Mile Creek were pretty easygoing. They wouldn't have been part of the cattle rustlers. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that is true. But I mean, at that stage, everyone did a bit of cattle rustling. Keep in mind, most of the people that worked on Mile Creek Station and the stations surrounding there were ex-convicts. Being offered a decent job as a stockman was pretty good. One of the things that they became convinced with that stood in the way of this new life of theirs was the existence of Aboriginal people who insisted this was their land.
It's an issue that's been faced by Indigenous people the world over. Occupiers arriving, seeking new lands and profits, slowly and surely decimating the culture that preceded them. I like historian Geoffrey Blaney's line. Across the world, many families sleeping each night beneath blankets of Australian wool didn't know the bloodshed which had accompanied the raising of part of that wool. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, something was discovered in the land that had a profound effect on Aboriginal-European relations and transformed this country and cities like this one virtually overnight. That discovery was gold. Every Australian school kid knows the discovery of gold in 1851 transformed Australia. But actually, it was kept a secret for decades. Convicts cutting a road near Bathurst were rumoured to have struck gold as early as 1814. So why weren't they shouting about it from the hills? Well, there was a bit of self-interest going on here on the part of the farmers and landowners whose interests were so strongly represented in government. They reckoned that if they announced the discovery of gold, then all their workers and the convicts would run off and start looking for it, which makes a lot of sense. Except when the gold rush was announced in California, loads of them ran off anyway to America. California was soon overrun by hundreds of thousands of prospectors from all over the world. The Englishman Edward Hargreaves was among those who tried his luck, and like so many others, left with nothing to show except a tan. But in 1851, back in New South Wales, his luck changed. There wasn't very much, not even enough to fill a tooth, but Hargreaves knew that gold, like gold prospectors, was never found on its own. This was a momentous discovery, and the story goes that when he made it, he jumped to his feet, turned to his prospecting partner, John Lister, and said, "This is a historic day for New South Wales. I'll be made a baronet, you'll be made a knight, and my horse will be stuffed, put in a glass case and sent to the British Museum." of those things actually happened, but Hargreaves knew how to talk up a story. He even talked the New South Wales government into awarding him £10,000 for his discovery. And in May 1851, the Colonial Secretary of New South Wales announced that gold had been discovered near the town of Bathurst. For the new colony of Victoria, this was a disaster. Almost overnight, the streets of the capital city, Melbourne, were deserted. Ships laid idle at anchor. The New South Wales gold rush threatened the very existence of the new colony. If the discovery of gold was the stimulus package New South Wales needed to prosper, it had the opposite effect on the other colonies. The mass exodus to the goldfields in the north was depleting the population of Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Victoria countered with a reward of its own for the first person to find a commercial quantity of gold. Ironically, gold had been discovered the year before in central Victoria, but the farmer wanted to keep it quiet because he didn't want his sheep disturbed. The 200 quid reward changed his tune and triggered a gold rush that would soon dwarf the one in New South Wales. Central Victoria would prove to be the richest alluvial goldfield the world had ever known. Nuggets the size of house bricks were being found. Tons of gold were being extracted. There was fever in the air. I'll show you what the fuss was all about. In here is the welcome nugget. It weighs an extraordinary 69.9 kilos, and at today's prices, it's worth 3 million Australian dollars. It was found by a Cornishman called Richard Jeffrey, and it was the headlines created by finds like this that brought diggers here from all over the world. This isn't the original, by the way, it's a replica. The original was melted down and turned into sovereigns. In 2 years, Victoria's population grew from 70,000 to more than 500,000. 1 in every 50 people in Britain migrated to the colonies. Overnight, there was a new class of new Australians, not convicts, but free thinkers and dreamers who came flooding in from all corners of the globe. They were intelligent, educated, idealistic, and incredibly diverse. There were diggers from Italy, Germany, China, America, Canada, Ireland. Some of them had fought wars in their own homeland, others had been expelled for their political activities, but ironically, they all thought that the convict colony could offer them freedom and the sniff of wealth. For some, striking it lucky remained just a dream, while others dug up wealth beyond their wildest imaginations. Free from the strictures of class and parish back in Europe, the diggers who hit pay dirt could live like kings. Some only for a day, but kings nonetheless. The goldfields became a place of extravagance and excess. There was one miner who bought all the champagne in a Melbourne hotel and tipped it in a horse trough so that everyone could have a slurp at it. And there was another one who trotted around on his horse, literally in golden horseshoes. Society was transformed. With all the money that was being thrown around, it's hardly surprising that sex and scandal soon followed. Scandal arrived in 1855. Her name was Lola, and yes, she was a showgirl. Lola Montez promoted herself as an exotic Spanish dancer, except Lola wasn't Spanish, Lola wasn't even Lola. She was plain Eliza Gilbert from the Irish county of Limerick. But she grew into the sort of girl that limericks are written about.
Lola was a bit of a gold digger too, and when she turned up in Ballarat, it must have been like Madonna was in town. She did this dance called the spider dance, where she had little bits of black material sewn on the various parts of her clothing, which she'd attempt to brush off during the dance. You can imagine how well that went down with the lads in Ballarat. And like all good celebrities, she punched a journalist when she was here. Well, she didn't actually punch him, she horsewhipped him in the bar of the United States Hotel.
The tour of Australia received mixed reviews. The beautiful and notorious performer died just 5 years later, aged 42. What must it have been like to live here on the diggings? Thousands arriving every week, the cry of Eureka in the air. I've come at a good time. Every year, the good people of Chewton celebrate a famous event from those days. Among the happy throng is Goldfields historian Robin Annear.
So did many of them actually get rich quick?
Yes, I think they did. And a lot of them spent it just as quickly, you know, on gold nugget earrings and fast women.
What do you think that the new settlements that they were now living in would have been like?
Oh, the settlements here on the gold rushes were tents, lots of tents. There wasn't much room to walk between them. You and your dog could get through, probably. Nearly everybody had a dog lashed to their tent to protect the gold, usually hidden somewhere therein. There were settlements of 4 to 5 men usually to a tent, and they took turn at being the housewife for the week, which was not a task that was enviable because they all criticised one another's cooking. Somebody would have put out the biggest log they could chop down and roll to that spot, and that would be the neighbourhood lounge. If that was near your tent, you were very favoured. The neighbourhood would gather of an evening, and so the hills and valleys around here were just covered in huge bonfires. Every night the stars were out and they felt like the kings of the world.
But the party couldn't last forever. The government wasn't going to allow the majority of the population to live in tents on the goldfields. It was a double disaster. No labour in the city and on the farms, and no tax revenue. The diggers' licence fee was their solution, and it was deeply unpopular.
Why did they get so upset about the licences?
Well, it was a tax, and why wouldn't they? Often they wouldn't find gold first up, or wouldn't find gold, enough gold to be constantly covering the cost of flour, and which all their supplies were very expensive. So it could be hard to afford a gold licence. But the main problem was the way in which their gold licences were checked by the troopers, by the police, and by the gold inspectors. This sort of behaviour of constantly being tapped on the shoulder by the troopers, who treated them in a very unfriendly and impolite fashion. There were little skirmishes where the police treated them in a more unruly fashion than they should have, burning tents down and so forth. But on the whole, they put up with it. But when we got to the point in December 1851, 3 or 4 months into the gold rushes, where the government, in order to impose control on the diggings and really make some of the diggers go back to their jobs and go back to working for the wealthy squatters, the government decided to double the cost of the gold licence, and that was just one step too far.
What happened? Tell me what happened.
Well, somebody put an advertisement up on the trees all around about the diggings here. Went up these notices: diggers, meet, gather, protest, and named a date, the 15th of December, in the place, the Shepherd's Hut, and all those thousands of diggers raised their voices as one.
It was an echo from the old country, where the English Chartists organised monster meetings in the 1840s in the struggle to give the working man a vote. In the wild frontier, the diggers wanted to be heard, while the government felt its grip on the colony was slipping. This monster meeting loomed as a mighty showdown between the immovable and the unstoppable.
We're defeated. We'll never be defeated.
It was the 15th of December 1851, and the word was out. Diggers were outraged at the doubling of the gold licence fee and at the intrusion on their liberty.
We'll never be defeated. I probably shouldn't say this here, but I do have a bit of sympathy with the authorities. After all, these thousands of people had just poured in to the colony, and there wasn't any infrastructure, there were no roads or anything like that, no law enforcement. It was pretty much chaos, so they did need some money. On the other hand, the gold diggers had probably spent their life savings getting here. When they got here, they had to pay for a licence. Now the licence was going to be doubled, and they'd have to carry it with them all the time. If they didn't, they were likely to be fined. You can see why things kicked off.
Hey, mate.
Oh, mate.
Many had come to the goldfields to break free from the shackles of the class system. Now they felt they were losing control of their own destiny and were determined to seize it back. On that hot summer day, more than 10,000 of them marched to a place called Shepherd's Hut. Jeff Hocking is a local historian who's written extensively on the monster meeting.
What happened when they all got here?
Well, they had speeches. People came and stood on a dray, just like we have here today, and they had rousing speeches saying to the government, we don't want to pay more taxes, we think it's unfair. After all, there was no infrastructure at all. There was nothing except police and tax gatherers, no roads, nothing was provided.
Will you pay the £3 licence? No! We're willing to pay a little, but skinned alive we will not be.
I think people were really saying we want to be free from the factory owners, from the squatters, from those people who make us chase sheep all day of our lives. This is an open land, we're free. We can make a new life for ourselves. It's not old England. And in a way they were quite shocked to find the government turning up so soon with rifles and muskets and bayonets demanding money.
Will you submit to oppression and injustice? No! Meet, agitate, be unanimous.
So they kind of won because they stopped the taxes being increased. But in a way, this was just the prelude to 2 or 3 years of struggle.
It's really the spark. It was ignited here at the monster meeting in Chewton and really burst a flame in Eureka 3 years later. So we claim quite proudly that our first steps to democracy in this country started here at this spot.
All across the goldfields, diggers had the scent of victory in their nostrils. For the first time, the labouring classes felt they had the upper hand. The feeling wouldn't last.
The government saw the writing on the wall, so what did it do? It built a bigger wall in the shape of a massively increased police force. They brought in extra police from Tasmania, from the London Met. They recruited eager young gentlemen, and these coppers didn't mess around. This is the log that the diggers were chained to if they couldn't produce their licences. And a lot of the police didn't wear uniforms. They went undercover, infiltrating the diggers' groups. The goldfields were well on their way to becoming a police state.
The crackdown only hardened the resolve of the diggers, whose numbers continued to swell. By the end of 1854, the goldfields were at flashpoint.
After months of negotiating with the authorities, the diggers tried direct action by setting fire to their licences. The police responded with more licence checks and more arrests. The mood got ugly. The diggers got more and more militant.
At the centre of all this rabble-rousing was a man who'd once studied to be a Catholic priest. His name was Raffaello Carboni. He'd left his native Italy to escape what he called tyrannical rulers and the law of the sword. And he was outraged by the Victorian government's heavy-handed tactics.
He found himself on the goldfields agitating for revolt and reform, and he gave a speech which is very much like a speech that another famous man gave over 100 years later. And in it, he fantasised about what life in Victoria ought to be like and how the Victorians were now being thwarted. He said, "I have a dream, a happy dream. I dreamt that we had met here together to render thanks to our Father in heaven for a plentiful harvest, such that for the first time in this our adopted land, we have our own food for the year. But not so, Britons, not so. We must redress the grievances inflicted on us, not by crown heads, but by blockheads, aristocratical incapables who never did a day's work in their lives.
The diggers believed their grievances had been heard. But the next morning, the authorities continued the harassment. It was the last straw for the diggers of Ballarat. They started to build a stockade on the goldfield called Eureka, a barrier to the licence checkers.
When the inevitable showdown occurred, 800 diggers marched two abreast towards Eureka. It was a bit like that moment at the beginning of the Olympic Games where you get all those people from different nations marching around the stadium. You had the Canadian flag bearer with the Southern Cross, the Italian Carboni being urged on by the Irishman Peter Laylaw, telling everyone to grab every piece of metal or wooden shaft that they could in order to plunge it into the tyrant's heart. You got French, German, Swedes, you got veterans from the American Revolution, all of them swept along on this tidal wave of emotion, determined to confront their oppressors and seize some kind of freedom for themselves.
Then, at dawn on Sunday the 3rd of December, when the stockade numbers were at their lowest, the troopers attacked. The killing was indiscriminate. Dozens lost their lives. It was said that some diggers were executed on the spot. Their leader, Peter Laylaw, was badly injured. His arm later amputated. The surviving leaders were arrested and charged with treason against Her Majesty Queen Victoria.
The prosecution had a pretty good case, didn't they?
Well, you would think so. I mean, it was obvious who were the rebels, and it was obvious the people in the dock were those who were within the stockade.
Who was the jury?
The jury was selected from Melbourne citizens, but they really worked very hard to make sure there were no Irishmen on the jury.
It really was an open and shut case against the rebels. The Crown produced witnesses, motives, all the evidence they'd need to send the diggers to the gallows. But when the jury retired, the most extraordinary thing happened. They returned a short time later to deliver the verdict, not guilty. One digger after another.
I think the problem was that they were all charged with treason.
Because the punishment was just so gruesome.
The punishment was extreme. I mean, it was still hung, drawn and quartered, which doesn't bear thinking about, really. And people just didn't want that sort of thing happening here on this goldfield, in this new colony, this new society that they were trying to build. And they weren't prepared to give the Crown that opportunity to do that.
Even Carboni got off, who was clearly guilty.
Carboni was obviously a bit of a nuisance, I think, and he was very intelligent, well-educated, and he was like a catalyst amongst all of the diggers because he could speak so many different languages, and a real revolutionary. After he was acquitted and subsequently became a mining warden in Ballarat, but left soon after and went back to Italy, and he fought with Garibaldi. So he was filled with that revolutionary fervour and pursued it back home.
Do you think it's fair to say that Eureka was the closest that Australia ever got to a revolution?
Oh, certainly. It's the only armed revolution where rifles were shot. They built a fort, they flew a flag, and they paraded like the military. I mean, they effectively became a military force.
The American writer Mark Twain summed it up pretty nicely. The Eureka Stockade is the finest thing in Australasian history. It was a revolution. Small in size, but great politically. It was a strike for liberty, a struggle for principle, a stand against injustice and oppression. It's another instance of a victory won by a lost battle. Soon after, the licence system was abolished, police numbers were cut dramatically, and political representation was extended to the miners. A new era was dawning, with new colonies such as South Australia, as well as old ones with new names like Tasmania, introducing legislative assemblies of ordinary citizens. Rule by governors was on the way out. Democracy was taking its place.
I reckon there's something rather unique about Australia. No revolution was required to get rid of its colonial masters, and no revolution was required to establish a new government. Yes, there was a bunch of pike-wielding seditionists who were accused of bearing arms, but what happened to them? They were freed, acquitted, and they ended up as businessmen and MPs. And this says something to me about the emerging Australian character of that time. First, you had a load of people challenging authority, and the next minute, they were the authority. And you know, I think there's still a bit of that happening around here, even today.
It's curious how quickly everyone moved on. Almost as though it had just been a football game or something. Victoria was now per capita one of the wealthiest places on Earth. Gold had transformed the young colony in a very short time. And now it wanted to flex its financial muscles. In the 70 years since colonisation, no one had crossed the continent from south to north. Many still believed that there was a great inland sea in the centre of Australia. So a group of prominent Victorians decided the first to do it would have to be one of their own. A pile of money was raised, and Robert O'Hara Burke, a country copper with no real bushcraft and poor leadership skills, was chosen to lead the cashed-up expedition. The man unfortunate enough to be his sidekick was William John Wills, whose father had amputated the arm of Peter Laylaw at the Eureka Stockade. The ambitious explorers would soon enter folklore, for all the wrong reasons.
Thousands of Australians go up and down this road in Royal Park in Melbourne every day, but I bet hardly any of them know what this extraordinary edifice is. It really is quite bizarre, isn't it? It actually marks the spot where Burke and Wills set off on their famous expedition. 15,000 cheering people saw them go. One of their carts broke down before they'd even left the park, and they only managed to make 11 kilometres on that first day. But then Burke turned round and galloped all the way back to Melbourne because he'd become obsessed by this 17-year-old girl and wanted to ask her to marry him. Whether or not she agreed, history doesn't record.
What we do know is that he never laid eyes on her again. The year was 1860. Burke and Wills led their expedition of 18 men, 22 horses and 25 ships of the desert into the unknown interior. Burke was ill-equipped in many ways to lead such a massive excursion, but not under-equipped by any means.
The list of things that they took with them is really quite extraordinary. Pages and pages of the stuff, and such a lot of it. 6 tons of firewood, and very bizarre things like 16 pairs of blankets for Asiatics, 4 dozen assorted nipples, 12 dandruff brushes, 60 pounds of curled horsehair, I love this one, 6 kangaroo thongs, 4 dozen looking glasses for natives, and a Chinese gong. They certainly didn't die because they ran out of kit.
Burke and Wills made it as far as Menindee, a tiny outpost in far western New South Wales. It's here that Burke started to go a bit balmy. he became paranoid that others would beat him in the cross-continental dash. Burke raced ahead of the main group to Cooper's Creek, going further than any white explorer before him. But that wasn't enough. He pushed on with just 3 other men, intending to be the first to traverse the continent of Australia. Dave Phoenix takes up the story.
Well, Burke had asked the depot party to wait at the Cooper Creek for 3 months. He thought that he could go from the Cooper halfway across Australia and back in about 3 months. Wills had the maps. He was a little bit more conservative. He realised how far they had to go, and he'd asked the depot party to stay for 4 months. After 4 months, the depot party decided they were going to leave. It took Burke 4 months and a week, and they got back to the depot the day the depot party left.
That is terrible luck.
Yeah, absolutely terrible luck. They've walked across the continent, they've walked halfway back, and they're just 9 hours too late.
Burke and Wills had missed the last bus. Their supplies were all but gone.
How did they survive?
They went on half rations at first, and then they went on quarter rations. The local Aborigines gave them food. They gave them rats. There was a plague of rats, so they had fat rats baked in their skins. They had fish, and this seed here, this is an aquatic fern. It's called nardoo, like a 4-leaf clover. And once this stuff's died and dried out, it has a little seed, a sporocarp on the bottom, and this is what the seeds look like. And the Aborigines would grind this stuff into a flour, make a sort of yellow flour, and they would either then make it into a dough and cook it in the fire as a bread, as a damper, or they would add a lot of extra water and have it as a gruel or a porridge. It's got quite a bitter taste. It hasn't got a lot of protein in there. Let's have a taste. It's quite bitter.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, doesn't really taste of much.
But ironically, the Aborigines may well have killed them with kindness. Dave's theory is that it was the nardoo that finished them off.
There's a toxin thiaminase in there which wipes out vitamin B1 in the body. Because the Aborigines had it as part of a varied diet, it's not, it doesn't have any real problems. But because Burke and Wills were living on this stuff exclusively, it gave them a disease called beriberi, wiped out all the vitamin B1 in the body. Whether it killed them or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly accelerated the deaths. When he got to the stage where Wills could no longer continue, and they built him a little shelter, they gathered him some nardoo and some firewood and some water from the creek. His bones were almost through his skin and his elbows, and then he realised he was close to death, and unless something turned up, he would die. And then Burke also couldn't continue, and in the morning he died as well.
So, ironically, Burke did get the fame that he'd been chasing.
Yeah, he wanted the fame of being an explorer, and he became famous. We're talking about him 150 years after he died, but unfortunately he didn't get the fame quite the way he thought. He wanted to go back to Melbourne as a hero. He got fame by dying.
As we look back from the 21st century, we can see that the tragic expedition wasn't a complete waste of time. Complete the picture of inland Australia and proved once and for all there was no inland sea.
Most of us have only heard of a handful of Australian explorers, either those who spectacularly succeeded or those who completely failed. But actually there were hundreds of them. Some, like Burke, were hugely funded, but most of them were little handfuls of stockmen who just rode that bit further than anyone else. And the result? They opened the country up to sheep, cattle, and the people who worked with them. And that transformed Australia.
Next time, I'm going to explore how a grab bag of remote colonies finally got their acts together.
For a long time, there wasn't really a place called Australia.
Was federation the realisation of one migrant's lofty dream?
That free passage was a pretty good investment, wasn't it?
Or did fear play a part in the forming of a nation which went on to become a multicultural success story?
What a great country where your destiny is in your own hands.
The little colony of New South Wales had a big problem. There was a desperate shortage of skilled labour, and the transport of convicts from the UK was about to come to an end. A solution was urgently needed.
A plan was hatched to flog off Crown land and use the money to recruit much-needed skilled labour from Mother England. They called it the Bounty Scheme, which makes me think of bounty hunters, and to some extent, that's the truth. Agents bobbed up in England and went around trying to talk unemployed people into moving to the colony. The more they signed up, the more money they made. So they weren't as fussy as they should have been about checking the skills of those they recruited.
When the ship arrived in port, a doctor would come on board. He'd check to make sure that the passengers were healthy, and if they were, then the shipping company would be paid some money. So, for instance, in 1840, the going rates were, if you were a husband and wife, then you were worth £38. For a child up to the age of 7, definitely under 7. £5. May we call your child between the age of 7 and 15? Thank you very much. £10. For an unmarried female domestic of childbearing age, 19 quid.
Migrants made the journey. And there was one quality that marked the new arrivals as different from those who'd come before. A great many of them were women.
The colonial governments were looking for fit, healthy people, but particularly women. There were so many men here during the convict era that they really needed to try and attract women to the colonies.
Must have been pretty scary for a woman to come here on her own to what had been a convict colony.
Absolutely, and it's my argument that they're really enterprising, courageous women who came on what they actually called bride ships.
Why did they call them bride ships?
Because they needed women as workers and also as marriage partners for the overwhelming numbers of men.
How did they persuade women to come over here?
The imperial government back home in London produced posters. They were put up in shops, in post offices. Ministers and priests used to talk about the ships from the pulpits. And so very educated women as well as less skilled women came out to Australia.
What kind of jobs did they do when they got here?
They're employed in a whole range of jobs, from governesses right through to dairy maids, cheese makers, and a whole range of domestic service.
Do you think those women had much of an influence on the Australian character?
I think so. People say the Australian character has been determined largely by the Irish convicts, but I think there's a pretty good argument to say the character of Australian women really follows down in a line from these very gutsy, courageous immigrant bounty women.
Scheme lasted less than 6 years. It collapsed under a deluge of complaints about migrants turning up without the skills they'd claimed to score themselves a free ticket. But not all the new arrivals were non-contributors.
Some bounty migrants did really well. There was one bloke called Henry who started life in bitter poverty on a farm in England. Then later, he lived in a single room with his pregnant wife in London and he couldn't get a job. He read the propaganda that said he could earn a fantastic 40 to 50 shillings a week in Australia, applied for a free passage and emigrated. And look how he ended up. Here he is on the $5 note, the nearest that Australia's got to a George Washington, a great politician, the father of federation, Henry Parkes. That free passage was a pretty good investment, wasn't it?
It was still an incredibly perilous thing to journey to the colony on the other side of the world at that time. Lives were lost on almost every ship. But few events in colonial history capture the dangers of immigrant travel better than the disaster that took place at a spot called the Gap, just outside Sydney Harbour in August 1857.
Imagine the scene. It was pitch black, there was thunder, lightning, and the good ship Dunbar was coming towards the end of an arduous and long 81-day journey from England, when suddenly it was hit by one of Sydney's legendary southerly squalls, and this one was a big one. Captain Green had got a tough call to make. He could either stay out at sea and weather the storm, or he could try and navigate through the heads and bring the ship and the 122 people on board into the safe haven of harbour. He decided to bring her in, and it was a fatal decision.
Captain Green, who'd been to Sydney 8 times before, drove his ship into the cliff face.
Kieran, what's known of the events of that night?
On the night of the Dunbar was wrecked, we believe the actual waves and the spray were actually washing over the cliffs behind us, so 50, 60 metres into the air. The impact was incredible. The decks were swept clean of people, utter confusion. These people were coming to Australia. They were one day out from one of the safest harbours in the world. They were probably asleep in their bunks, all below decks. Next minute, the water would have been pouring in, women and children screaming and men trying to save the vessel. But it was all too late. The ship began to break up.
It was so close to the shore, I'm surprised that virtually everybody died.
Only one survivor, James Johnson, only survived by managing to scramble up the last remaining mast and then getting onto the cliff face. No one else managed to do that.
Was it known as a dangerous coast in the mid-19th century?
Sydney Harbour has always been raved about as being a very safe harbour, and it is internally a very safe harbour. Off the coast, however, there's about a shipwreck every 6 kilometres, and around the entrance to Sydney Harbour is approximately 100 shipwrecks. Australia has over 9,000 shipwrecks around the coastline.
But shipwrecks weren't the only dangers facing emigrants. There were also the invisible killers on board.
It's a wonder that anyone arrived here at all to help kickstart the new colony, because if shipwrecks didn't get you, then disease would. That was certainly true of one particular ship that's gone down in maritime history because of the dreadful series of events that unfolded on her. She was called the Ticonderoga.
An American-built megaship who could carry twice as many people as most other vessels of the era. Bigger ships meant more profits for the shipping companies. Passenger comfort wasn't their concern. Almost 800 souls crammed the double decks of the Ticonderoga, mostly young families with their sights set on starting a new life. But unbeknownst to them, on board there lurked an invisible killer. Deadly typhus, a terrible disease transmitted by lice. Sadly, it took the children first, and among them was little 1-year-old Caroline Lambton.
There's always something bleak about a burial at sea. Caroline's body would have been sewn in sailcloth, weighted down with chains or iron bars, and then placed on a little wooden board. Then the family and the passengers and the crew would have gathered round. The captain would have read the service. A little bell would have rung. And when the captain got to the words, "We therefore commit her body to the sea," the board would have been lifted and Caroline would have been tipped into the ocean. And then the ship would have sailed on. No grave, no memorial, just a vast emptiness.
But Caroline wasn't the last. 2 months from port, it became a full-blown epidemic. More than 100 people died on the journey as the disease flourished in conditions as cramped as a giant sardine can.
By now, the stench from all the typhoid victims was overwhelming. 2 or 3 people a day were dying, the medical supplies had run out, and it was freezing cold. In bad weather, they couldn't throw the bodies overboard, and they had to stack them on the decks. In good weather, it was even worse. There were sharks swimming around the boat now, and every time a body went over, a shark would snatch it and swim away with it. In fact, the sailors started throwing the bodies of the children and the babies overboard at night so that the parents could avoid the grief of seeing what the sharks did to them.
90 days after her departure, the Ticonderoga limped into Port Phillip Bay, flying the yellow flag to alert the port authority of the dangers aboard.
Captain Draper of the pilot boat that met the ship wrote in his log, "The large ship got into Port Phillip safely. She was crowded with passengers and they all called out in frightful yells, 'Don't come on board as we're dying of fever.'" They had lost 102 on the passage.
The Ticonderoga was a tragic start to a wave of migration that had no precedent anywhere in the British Empire. Within the next few years, ships from all over the world were making Melbourne, the muddy little settlement on Port Phillip Bay, the #1 travel destination in the world. And it wasn't the weather that brought them, it was this stuff. Gold. More hopeful prospectors turned up in just 2 years than arrived in 80 years of transportation. From all corners of the globe they came and spread out across the countryside like a plague of locusts, cutting it down and digging it up. But not all were welcome. The Chinese were the largest foreign contingent on the Victorian goldfields, almost 1 in 10 of all miners, and they were good at it too. In just 1 year, they shipped more than 5.5 tons of bullion back to China. Perhaps their success bred envy. Perhaps it was their lack of Christianity, which at that time many considered the measure of human worth. Whatever the reason, they were an easy target.
They levelled all sorts of ridiculous allegations against the Chinese, exactly the kind of thing you'd expect when racial tensions hot up. They accused them of muddying the water so that other people couldn't pan for gold properly. They said they trawled their way through the mining rubble that belonged to the Europeans. They accused them of importing un-Christian vices. There was even an organisation called the Anti-Chinese League that toured the goldfields, trying to wind up the diggers against them.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be among like-minded, white, Christian friends, English friends. This great British colony is in danger of becoming overrun with hordes of godless, barbarian Chinese. And as their numbers keep growing, the animosity between the Chinese and the Europeans is only getting worse. A halt to all Chinese immigration is required immediately.
The Chinese were often victimised, most famously in the riot at Lambing Flat in New South Wales. Later, when the gold fever subsided, most Chinese miners returned to their ancestral homes. Those who stayed simply added to the multi-ethnic fabric of the new society that gold had created. Their greatest challenge wasn't racism. It was finding a home to raise their children in the overcrowded cities. For years, a ring of canvas had encircled Melbourne, a tent city to accommodate the thousands arriving weekly to seek their fortune. Everyone knew a more permanent housing solution had to be found, and when it did arrive, it came in packing cases. Prefabricated iron houses, manufactured in England and shipped out in wooden crates to be assembled like giant Meccano sets, would house the growing numbers who wanted something better than a tent to call home.
There used to be hundreds of metal houses like this one here in Melbourne. In fact, that area behind me is still known as Tin Pan Alley. They were made of corrugated iron. They were only ever supposed to be temporary. And one of the good things about these is that they do still keep out the rain. All this is a bit of a surprise, isn't it? The whole place looks much nicer than you might have expected. The reason is because although the walls are made of metal, they've been covered over with wood. In this case, it's the packing cases that the bits for the house originally came in. But there was one problem that even the wood couldn't eradicate. Because the walls were made of metal, they were freezing cold in the winter and boiling in the summer. Still, at least it was better than living in a tent all year round. Cool, this one's seen better days, hasn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid it has. We need a millionaire for this one.
How many do you reckon there were in Melbourne?
There were, in this area, hundreds of buildings, not just houses, all sorts of buildings. But I think there were over 30,000 brought into the colony.
Why so many?
People were rushing to the colonies after the gold rush in 1851, and of course there was no accommodation for them. A lot of the tradesmen had gone off to the goldfields. So the government originally put aside a camping ground, and then, of course, when they were able to release land for sale, entrepreneurs very quickly took advantage of that and started to become property developers. You could actually choose the house you wanted from a catalogue.
Could anyone build one of these?
That was the theory. And the idea was that you could pick them up from the docks and perhaps even in a day you put them together because they just generally bolted together.
So you didn't need a builder to come in?
Not necessarily, no.
What kind of people would have lived here?
Well, it's interesting. You would think it was perhaps the poorest people in the local community, but that's not the case. You had a mixture of people, civil servants, carpenters, stonemasons, etc.
It's a miracle that even one of these iron kit homes survived. Melbourne, probably more than anywhere else on Earth, was in a state of constant evolution in the late 19th century. Flush with tax revenue from the diggings, the civic leaders tried to build Rome in a day. Banks, hotels and coffee palaces sprang up. In 1885, a visiting English journo called it Marvellous Melbourne. Of course, this wasn't well received by the other colonies. Sydney hated that Melbourne had replaced it as the #1 city in the Antipodes. But in truth, rivalry existed between all the colonies, who saw themselves as unique, independent, and somehow superior to the others. Let's draw you a picture.
This is just a rough idiot's guide for rough idiots like me, but in 1788 the First Fleet arrived here in Botany Bay, and for the next 40 years or so there was only one colony. It was called New South Wales, and it stretched right from here in the north of Australia all the way right to the bottom, and it even included this massive island called Van Diemen's Land. In fact, throughout some of that time it even included New Zealand, which was way over the sea in that direction. But then, in 1825, the people of Van Diemen's Land decided they wanted their own colony and created what we now know as Tasmania. Meanwhile, on the other side of this huge bit of land, right here somewhere, there was a little outpost called the Swan River Colony, which became Perth. They decided that they wanted to be a colony too and created Western Australia. And then down here, you've got a bunch of free settlers, not convicts, around Adelaide. They set up South Australia, originally went round like that and then eventually shot all the way up here to the north coast. Over here you've got Brisbane and Queensland nicks the top third of New South Wales, and down here you've got Melbourne. It was originally called Batmania after a bloke called John Batman. I don't know why they changed the name to Melbourne. Batmania is such a cool name. But anyway, they eventually create Victoria. Then finally, this top half of South Australia gets taken away from them and they set up the Northern Territory here. Very interesting, but not quite as exciting as sandcastles.
The point of the story is that all these 6 colonies developed in relative isolation from each other because they were separated by long sea journeys. But the world was changing. 2 of Great Britain's sworn enemies, Germany and France, had bases nearby. Fear of invasion got people talking. Having the colonies unite for their own defence seemed like a good idea. But it would be easier said than done.
The train on platform 3 goes to Lisco. First stop, Glenwood, Blackburn, Greenwood, Glenwood.
In Europe or America, you don't really have to go very far to get to the next town. But in Australia, you can drive for a whole day without seeing another human being.
Back in the 19th century, it could take weeks to get from one place to the next because the only way to do it was by sea. Everyone understood that the colonies simply had to join forces if they were going to defend themselves. But how could they do it? Well, the answer was simple.
It was a no-brainer, a network of railways crisscrossing the continent, easy peasy. Well, actually it wasn't. It proved so difficult, it became almost impossible. And it was for the most childish of reasons. In the 1850s, both New South Wales and Victoria decided they wanted brand new shiny railway systems, and they both opted for the broad gauge system. At least they did until the last moment when New South Wales changed its mind and went for a standard gauge. But then Queensland thought to itself, we can't afford all this high tech. We'll go for the narrow gauge system, which was much cheaper, but also went round bendy corners much more efficiently. And apparently there were lots of bendy corners in Queensland at the time. To make matters worse, South Australia went for a combination of the broad gauge and the narrow gauge. So you'd got all these different gauged railways chuntering round Australia. Now, you would have thought that at that moment someone would have said, wait a minute, guys, decide on one single gauge so you can transport all your people and your industry and your armies round this great emerging country without them having to change trains all the time. But it didn't happen. In fact, when all these great railway systems converged in the 1880s, they didn't join up. It meant that if you wanted to go from Perth to Darwin, you had to get on a train, change onto another train, and another, and another, and another, and another. 7 different trains from Perth to Darwin.
It wasn't until 2004, 35 years after man landed on the moon, that Adelaide was finally connected to Darwin by standard gauge railway. So how did the 6 independent colonies finally join together as a nation? Well, it might have started with a bet. Remember Henry Parkes, the bounty migrant on the $5 note? The story goes he boasted to the Governor of New South Wales, Lord Carrington, that he could federate the colonies in 12 months if he just put his mind to it, and Carrington dared him to try. So at 74 years of age, Parkes took up the challenge. A few months later, in October 1889, he made a famous speech.
The great question, whether the time has not now arisen for the creation on this Australian continent of an Australian government. Australia has now a population of 3.5 million, and the American people numbered only between 3 and 4 million when they formed the great Commonwealth of the United States. The numbers are about the same, and surely what the Americans have done by war, the Australians can bring about in peace. Thank you very much. And with those words, Henry Parkes, the bounty migrant, planted the metaphorical seeds of federation. And a year later, in 1890, right here outside Melbourne's Parliament House, he planted another seed, an acorn, which became that, the Federation oak. And the idea of federation, like that oak tree, grew and prospered.
Despite all the pettiness and squabbling, the fathers of federation finally got their daughter to the altar. It took a while, nearly a decade in fact, but by 1898, a majority of the colonies said yes to becoming one Australian people. Sadly, Parkes didn't live to see it. 10 years after Parkes's famous speech, a small delegation of Australian politicians arrived in London to negotiate the passing of the Federal Constitution Act through the British Parliament. They returned home with a blueprint for the creation of a new country, most notable for the amount of compromise and amendment it contained. But while the 6 colonies were now the 6 states of Australia, they hadn't all agreed to join. Nope, it's like that old line about not wanting to belong to any club that will have you as a member.
Ironically, it was only after this momentous law had been passed in Britain that Western Australia decided to have a referendum on whether or not there should be a Commonwealth of Australia. To its credit, all women were allowed to vote, and to its credit too, they said yes.
Inauguration, the fulfilment of the dreams of so many, took place on a steamy New Year's Day in 1901 at Centennial Park, Sydney. Present was Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of York, and as many as 150,000 proud Australians. The nation's first parliament was opened a few months later at Melbourne's exhibition buildings. 12,000 dignitaries packed the hall to pose somberly for the recording of the occasion by one of the country's most loved artists, Tom Roberts. So what sort of country was Australia to be? The country's founding fathers dreamt of a model democracy based on equality and freedom. But some were more equal than others. The utopian paradise would be for white people only. For the dream to be realised, the walls of Fortress Australia would have to be strengthened. How they set about that task is one of the darkest moments in Australia's short history. The Commonwealth of Australia was born, but it was a less than auspicious start. One of the first things debated in the House was the Immigration Restriction Act. In time, it became known simply and ominously as the White Australia policy. At its core is an idea invented by the British and perfected in South Africa: the dictation test. To enter the country, you have only to write down 50 words as read to you by a customs official. But there's a catch. The words can be in any European language. The intention was to keep out non-whites, but the test could also be used to exclude anyone deemed undesirable.
The whole business of the dictation tests came to a head in 1934 over a bloke called Egon Kisch, who was kicked out of his home in Nazi Germany because he was not only a Jew, he was a political activist and an anti-fascist and a communist. So he tried to get into Australia, but when his boat arrived in Fremantle, the government said, no, you're not coming in. So the boat sailed on to Port Melbourne. Once again, the government said, you're not coming in. And there was a little crowd round the boat, and Kisch was so excited, he jumped off it. And this was a big ocean liner, and when he hit the harbour side, he smashed his leg in.
But the police just carried him back on board. Eventually, he was brought ashore in Sydney on crutches to sit the infamous dictation test, which had been used to successfully exclude so many. But Egon was fluent in lots and lots of European languages. So what could the government do to keep him out?
Come in and have a seat.
Thank you very much. OK.
OK. And we'll start. Nahar, ha, nef.
Could you say that again, please?
Nahar, ha, nef.
Kisch was asked to transcribe the Lord's Prayer from an obscure branch of the Gaelic language, rarely spoken outside the Hebrides Islands of Scotland.
Higich do rioch. Naran lachel. Agus yn chwach.
Remember, this is a test for entry to Australia. And Egon is being asked to take a dictation in one of the least spoken languages in Europe.
Gu shiri. Amen. Thank you very much. Have a look at it.
The public and the media thought this test had been daft. The case went to the courts, and eventually Kisch was allowed into Australia. So what did he do? He went all around the country, attending meetings, telling everyone that Hitler was evil, that the Nazis wanted a big war, and that they'd build huge concentration camps. See, the government was right. He was a radical loony. Did I pass?
This is a fail.
I did get amen right, didn't I?
You got amen right, but I cannot see any other correct words in here. Thank you.
Was Australia the only country that was implementing this kind of policy?
No, Australia was part of a much larger club, really, but they were very confident that they were leading the world, and they were proud that they were leading the world. The White Australia policy was really Australia's declaration of independence, because on the one hand, technically, we didn't become completely independent from Britain, but it was Australia's way of saying, this is our particular distinctive country.
Why did the politicians want to do that?
They thought that a white democratic country would have a much higher standard of living, that everybody could be equal, that everybody would share all of these things, but the everybody, of course, you know, meaning whites only.
How long did this stream of what we would think of as racist legislation exist in Australia?
Australia continues to proudly define itself as white Australia well into the 1940s, when both through internal domestic protest and a sort of a growing sense of shame, and also a lot of external pressure, and we start to retreat from that notion of Australia as a sort of white bastion. And the dictation test is actually repealed in 1958, which I think is some sort of recognition, you know, of what a terrible, dastardly role it played.
In the years before World War II, it was said Australia was more British than Britain.
Off you go now. Don't be late. Bye, Mummy. Bye-bye.
40 years of racially based immigration had created a bastion of white Europe in what remains geographically Asia. But the war had an unexpectedly positive effect on the Australian economy. After decades riding on the sheep's back, the country was forced to industrialise for the war effort. nation desperately needed more people to complete the transformation into a modern industrial society.
So under the slogan, populate or perish, she accepted huge amounts of migrants from all over war-torn Europe, and they transformed Australia forever.
So how did the government do it? They simply told the Australian people that the new migrants were really just like us.
Well, it took a long time, eh? But we're there at last.
But in fact, the first group to arrive were from war-ravaged Europe. Refugees grateful to start life anew as far from their old homes as it was possible to be. And they just kept coming, each new wave making its own unique contribution to an ever-changing society. Many were sent to work on remote public works projects, like the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, and they toughed it out. In so doing, they played a huge role in creating the long period of prosperity that lasted into the 1970s. The dominance of white Australia was slowly fading away. But there was one group of post-war migrants who were given no choice in starting new lives in the lucky country. They're sometimes referred to as Britain's stolen generation, taken from their parents and shipped to Australia for their own good. 10,000 children left the British Isles under the Child Migrant Scheme, which lasted almost 20 years and did untold damage to so many families.
Your early years were in an orphanage?
Right up to the age of 10.
So how did they tell you that you were going to be sent to Australia?
They separated 3 of us from the other children, and we thought we were something special. We were given special food, special clothes, and told that we were going to Australia. And we didn't know where Australia was, never heard of it.
Weren't you worried that you'd never be able to track your parents down?
I didn't know anything about my parents. I was told my parents were dead. But 1953, when I was coming to Australia, the first time they'd ever mentioned it, I was told, your parents are both dead and you have no brothers and sisters.
And they put you in another orphanage?
Well, here's the orphanages. This is a photo of me. That was in Glasgow when I was 5 years old.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's...
That's the boat?
That's the ship that I came out on. It's the New Australia. This is in Geraldton, 300 miles north of Perth. That's where I grew up till I was 17. And this is me when I arrived in Geraldton.
What kind of jobs did you do when you came back to Australia?
In the orphanage, I was in the kitchen cooking for 200 people, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. 5 o'clock in the morning we got up, and 8 o'clock we went to bed without a penny paid.
Do you think people still have hang-ups about the experience that they underwent?
Yes, a lot of the child migrants do. A lot of them haven't really been able to talk about it to anybody, and so they've bottled it up inside.
It's a bit of a stain on the governments, isn't it?
I suppose it is, but I mean, when you look into the history of different countries, they've all got these hidden secrets that haven't yet come out. I mean, how long did it take for the Australian government to say sorry to the stolen generation, the Aboriginals from Australia?
To anyone who lived in Australia at the time of the Second World War, the multicultural face of any modern city would be incomprehensible. Since the middle of the 20th century, more than 7 million people have immigrated to Australia's sandy shores. Many of those post-war migrants now have Australian-born grandkids and consider themselves as Aussie as a Vegemite sandwich. But it's fair to say not every new wave of migrants has been welcomed with open arms. As this wall and this area of Sydney attest, Australia is a nation of immigrants. And no wave of new arrivals has had more impact than the 100,000 Vietnamese who arrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s, escaping a humanitarian catastrophe. Nonetheless, at the time, many Australians opposed their arrival. It's estimated that as many as 250,000 people died trying to escape the horrors in their homeland.
Thanks, boss.
But one of the lucky ones who made it grew up to become one of Australia's favourite comedians, Arn Doe.
Oh,
very
not
nice.
bad.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is your patch, isn't it? Everybody wants to stop you and say hi.
I grew up here, Tony. Yeah, a lot of Vietnamese here. I came over to Australia on a boat. I was a refugee. 40 Vietnamese on a 9-metre fishing boat, Tony. 5 days at sea, we ran out of food and water at one point. We're attacked by pirates.
So you're how old at this time?
I was 2.5. 9 men with knives, machetes and guns rammed their boat into ours.
Yeah.
And they climb onto our boat, they take everything. And then one of the pirates picks up the smallest child on the boat. He lifts up the little baby, and he rips open the baby's nappy, and 150 Australian worth of gold falls out, right?
Yeah,
now the pirate swears and dangles the kid over the ocean, threatens to throw the baby in. My father screams out, "We have to save the child, it's a big standoff." For whatever reason, the pirate decides to spare the kid's life. He throws him back in and he lets him live. And that's a good thing, because that kid is my little brother, Hua Do. You know what, Tony? Hua Do was 6 months old at the time. He grew up to become the 2005 Young Australian of the Year for his work with charity.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you when you got over to Australia?
Not at all. Australia is such a welcoming country, you know?
I wasn't expecting you to say that. I thought you would tell me about all the racism and being picked on and everything.
Yeah, no, not at all. The first thing that happened, actually, was a nun came and gave my family a big box of clothes. And half the clothes were for a little boy and half were for a little girl, right?
Yeah.
And there's me and my little brother. Now, my mum is too polite to give the clothes back.
Yeah.
She dresses my brother in girls' clothes for the first 6 months we're here.
This is the one who became the Young Australian of the Year.
Absolutely. So if you have a little boy and you want him to become future Young Australian of the Year, put him in a little dress. That's the secret.
The notorious dictation test is long gone. But you still have to sit an exam if you want to become a citizen of this country. So would Arn Doe, who is obviously an outstanding contributor and an asset to Australia, be able to pass the test?
Right, this is the citizenship test. You want to have a crack?
Mm-hmm. I studied law, Tony.
This should be no problem for you
Should
at
be
all.
a piece of cake.
Which arm of government has the power to interpret and apply laws? The legislative, the executive, or the judicial?
Executive.
Get out of this country. You know nothing. You're an ignorant man.
Doesn't the executive sound like it's the top notch?
Yeah, but I think it's wrong.
The most important?
What is the name of a proposal to make a law in Parliament? Royal assent, bill, or debate?
Assent. Is that assent?
I think you're banned from the country, mate.
I'm gone.
What kind of questions would you want to see?
Oh, you know, Aussie ones, like it's Saturday morning, it's starting to drizzle a bit. Do you mow the lawn now or do you wait till tomorrow? You know? And take the risk that it'll rain all weekend.
Just tear this up, Joe.
That's it.
What do these admission tests say about Australia today? This is one of the most multicultural countries on Earth and one of the most peaceful. The experiment in opening the doors to people from all countries is clearly working. And yet the debate about who should be welcome is as hot as it ever was.
If you came out here nowadays, though, it wouldn't be that kind of welcome mat, would it? You'd be the yellow peril. You'd be the guys who are coming over here swamping Australia with noodles and spring rolls.
I don't think so. Certainly refugees are being viewed differently at the moment. I think after September 11, Australians are more fearful of things that are different from the outside, you know? We've become a little bit more insular.
It is tougher to get in now, isn't it?
I think so, yeah, it is. Certainly by boat it is.
You're so up about the whole thing. I'm trying to goad you into telling me what a terrible place this is, how we whites dominate you all the time, and you won't give an inch.
Well, you know, as soon as my parents arrived, they said, "Arn, what a great country this country Australia is," and that's how they brought us up, you know?
Yeah.
What a great country where your destiny is in your own hands. Kids, if you give it a crack and see what happens, you can really make something of your life. That's what Mum and Dad taught us.
His brother's Young Australian of the Year. It ought to have been you, mate. I do wonder if Australia's willingness to accept outsiders has changed in recent years. Something I know from my travels is that taxi drivers give you a pretty good handle on the views of a country. What would happen if I surveyed a few and asked them, do they think the welcome mat is still out? Do you think you're more suspicious of foreigners than your kids are?
Oh, yes. I used to make statements not necessarily friendly towards a lot of newcomers, and my kids used to be horrified. They'd say, "Dad, how can you say such things?"
What about racism in Australia?
To be honest, I haven't come across to those peoples.
Is there a problem about so much migration?
I think we need it. We have a very small population and we need it for the economy of the place.
In more recent times, we've seen so many changes that you just get used to change, and it's not a problem at all.
Australians in general, they don't want to hurt you, but they don't really care much.
When I came here, I've been given a very strange advice. You know, when you get to a certain place that you're not aware of or you don't know much about it, you ask the cab driver how things are and stuff like that. He said, you should be careful. And I said, about what? And he said, two W's, a weather and a woman. They're very unpredictable. So that was the advice from a cabbie 21 years ago.
And you've taken that advice?
I did.
There we go.
Thanks a lot, mate. I think many Australians still wrestle with the question of who should be welcome in their country. But they also see themselves as a nation of immigrants, which is true. A quarter of the country's 22 million people were actually born overseas. And when you think about it, even the original inhabitants, the Aborigines, migrated here, albeit more than 40,000 years ago. From the start of white settlement to the recent wave of immigration from East Africa, Australia's grand narrative has been the story of people coming to this vast continent and finding their place in it. And for most of them, it's a story with a happy ending. In the next and final leg of my journey, I'm going to explore what more than 200 years of European settlement has created. Anyone fancy fish and chips? How Australia grew up.
They're wrestling on the bridge. Wrestling on the bridge.
To become the country she is today.
Hey!
Hang on. It could be a bumpy ride.
Whoops.
Sports teams started representing Australia long before Australia itself formally existed. One of the world's greatest games is this one, and one of its greatest sporting rivalries, some would say one of its sacred traditions, is of course the Ashes. It started out as a joke.
After Australia had beaten England at her own game in 1882, Reginald Brooks wrote a mock obituary. In affectionate memory of English cricket, which died at the Oval, the body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia.
I always thought that after the Oval match was over, the bails and the stumps were burned and put in some sort of pot, and ever after, Australia and England played for the Ashes. But I was totally wrong. The Ashes were created here. This is Rupert's Wood in Victoria. And in the 1880s, it was the home of Sir William Clark. And he'd met the England team when they were coming over to Australia on the boat in that same year, 1882. And he invited them here for Christmas. And they played a game of cricket. It was only a friendly. No one was really counting the score. But after it was over, the local ladies picked up the bails. They threw them onto the fire. Then they put them in a terracotta perfume pot, and that was the beginning of the struggle for probably the most unprepossessing trophy in the history of world sport.
The reason Australia could even field a cricket team was that a remarkable change had taken place in Australian society, and very few people today know about it. In the middle of the 19th century, it suddenly dawned on the Australian worker that he was valuable. There was a skilled labour shortage in the cities. A world away from the smog of England's Industrial Revolution, Australia's workforce began to organise.
It started when a bunch of stonemasons kicked off. They said that in the Australian heat, 8 hours was the appropriate length of time for anybody to work. And then the builders in Melbourne agreed with them until eventually there was a whole cacophony of support until finally on the 21st of April 1856, 8 hours became the official working day. And that was a world first. But why here in Australia?
The answer lies in Australia's DNA. It was a country conceived as banishment for England's rejects and born in grim isolation. Brutal rule was met with spirited defiance. The class system had been left behind. Respect was earned, not inherited. And from that, the free workforce freely questioned their plight.
What seems to me so bizarre about the struggle for the 8-hour day, the part that seems so truly, madly, deeply Australian, is that when they won it, the workers were given a holiday. In other words, they took time off for getting time off. Here you are, lads.
So what the 8-hour day bought Australians was time to play. And play they did. I believe it's one of the reasons this country is so annoyingly good at sport. With the possible exception of cricket. There was even a team representing indigenous Australia. This team, photographed in 1867, toured England for 6 months. Sadly, they were regarded more as a circus troupe than serious sportsmen. The Daily Telegraph wrote of Australia, "Nothing of interest comes from there, except gold nuggets and black cricketers."
It took another 30 years before a 10-hour day was established in England. It was a 12-hour day in France, but because of the stonemasons, the Australians had that beautiful balance of 8 hours work, 8 hours play, and 8 hours sleep, which presumably you can take during the cricket.
Generations into the social experiments that began with a penal colony in 1788, the Australian character was taking form. A colonial house with a picket fence and a backyard the size of Twickenham. A land of opportunity, a country where you could really make your mark. And the future future never looked brighter. But that was about to change.
1914 was the beginning of the end of innocence for Australia. There were rumblings of war from the other side of the world. The German Empire's aggressive expansionism was directly threatening the interests and the security of Great Britain. And when Mum was under threat, her young child, Australia, was ready to run to her side.
Australia had already offered up its youth for wars in Sudan, South Africa, even the Boxer Rebellion in China. But this was the big one. Being a valued part of the Commonwealth gave the new nation security and a sense of place in the world.
When war was declared on August the 4th, 1914, even while Britain's forces were starting to mobilise, Australia was battle-ready. In fact, the first Allied shot fired in World War I wasn't in Holland or Belgium or France or England, but thousands of miles away, here at Point Nepean.
And Major Bernie Gaynor is going to show me what happened.
So who was the first shot fired at?
First shot was fired at a German freighter, the SS Fels.
Where was it?
The Fels was docked in Melbourne, about 80 kilometres over there. It had departed at dawn. It was coming up the South Channel.
Had war been declared?
War had been declared, but news that war had been declared had not reached here. War had been declared about 2 hours previously. Just as it was coming past here, the word came from the headquarters over at Queenscliff that war had been declared. A young officer, whose name was Veal, directed the guns to fire a warning shot across the bows of the Fels. And that's what happened.
And the guns are up here?
This gun fired at around about 2.5 hours after war was declared in London. And that is why this gun was the first gun among any of the Allied nations to fire a shot in World War I.
So did the ship stop when the gun was fired?
Well, not immediately, because the Australian pilot on the bridge, Captain Robinson,
yes,
immediately telegraphed to the engine full astern.
Yeah.
The German, realising with horror what was happening, immediately countermarted and telegraphed full ahead. And so for a brief period, there was a physical tussle.
They're wrestling on the bridge.
Wrestling on the bridge.
Robinson and the German.
Robinson and the German. They were physically fighting. Go forward, go back.
Yeah.
Stop, surrender. No, I'm not. Until finally, Captain Robinson said, if you don't stop, the next shot will be into the ship.
No, that's me. If you don't stop, the next shot will be into the ship.
Yeah, well, mine here.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. At that point, the German realised that he could do nothing. He stopped and he surrendered.
Sometimes, just sometimes, I can wear my name with pride.
For a generation of Australians, war was a round-the-world ticket to adventure. Teenagers and young men signed up by the thousand for king and country. But for 60,000 young Australians, it turned out to be a one-way ticket. Nearly 9,000 died at Gallipoli alone. Per capita, Australia sacrificed more lives for England than anyone except the Irish.
By 1918, the First World War was over and 19th century imperialism was on its way out. But how was Australia going to be able to transform itself from that loose collection of distant colonies thrown together by Federation a few years previously into a thriving, modern 20th century state? It's true that she just contributed to the defeat of the aggressors in Europe, but there was another tyranny much closer to home that she'd been struggling with for decades, and that too would have to be defeated if Australia was going to unite as a nation.
The tyranny of distance. Just look at it. Even today, the space between the cities on the island continent is vast. Early in the 20th century, Australians weren't just isolated from the rest of the world, they were isolated from each other. By 1910, the only way forward was suddenly obvious. Almost exactly 100 years ago, the first successful flight by an Australian in Australia took place in a plane almost identical to this, and we're going to try and recreate that moment. While the Wright brothers were grabbing all the headlines around the world, there was movement at Mr. and Mrs. Dygan's property, Spring Plains in Maya, Victoria. Their two sons, John and Reggie, were tinkering with a contraption they'd more or less copied from a postcard. It was 1910, and while American upstart Harry Houdini had already stolen their thunder by claiming the first powered flight in Australia, the Dygan brothers built and flew the first Australian-made plane on the 16th of July, 1910. What's so significant about the original Dygan flight?
It was the first powered flight in Australia, built by an Australian.
But Harry Houdini had flown over here before, hadn't he?
Yes, he came over, but that was an imported plane, and he flew over from America, did his flight and went back again.
Yeah.
But nobody in Australia had started from scratch. So much Australian history is under the carpet. We pay a lot of homage to overseas history, kings of England and all that sort of thing. But when I went to school, I never heard anything about the first flight designed by an Australian who did everything himself.
Our pilot today is nearly as old as aviation. 74-year-old Ben Buckley.
Where do you want the plane, Ben? I want the plane right there. Yeah. So as I can get the best angle into wind. Yeah. And the best slope.
Are you a bit scared?
No, but I'm apprehensive, and I'll be in full consultation with the Almighty, I can tell you.
And you're letting your dad do this?
I can't stop him. He's been doing this sort of thing since I was knee-high to a grasshopper.
What do you have to watch out for?
Well, I'm not quite sure yet. I'm a bit
And they've got a vital role for me to play. They know not what they do. So what I've got to do is I've got to run along, but this may go down. So when I'm running along, I've got to try and keep it up in the air as well.
Let me get this jalopy started.
So we're about to make or break history.
This, believe it or not, is the is the starter key. The heavy old thing. And I have to line this up. Go on, Ben. Yes.
That's it. Contact.
Whoops. Houston, we have a problem.
Whoa, 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 whoa! Whoa, whoa, whoa! You right? Yeah. We got it off, didn't we? I don't think so. Why? Why did it veer off? Because you didn't lift the wing properly, Get man. off! In my report, I'll blame you, Tony.
That dung heap saved your life, mate. You'd have been in an ambulance if it hadn't been for that.
Well, I've been in the shit a few times, Tony, but this has been on my side this time.
It was.
Eh?
Makes you realise what a strong team Digan must have had, and what a lot of effort, skill, know-how, and indeed what a lot of luck he must have had, because I tell you, one gust and this whole thing goes wrong. He managed to fly a kilometre, we got one wheel off the ground and ended up in that stuff. And that was 100 years later.
Aviation was the great leap forward for Australia. But in the late 1930s, there was conflict once again over the horizon. On September the 3rd, 1939, Australia heeded the call from Mother England. Britain was at war, and therefore so too were her dominions.
I've got an eerie sense of déjà vu. Not only was the first shot of World War I fired from here, but the first Australian shot of World War II was fired from where?
The same gun, the same position.
How come? That is so eerie.
Indeed it was. A very strange turn of events. What happened in World War II was that war had been declared. A whole new series of regulations required of merchant vessels entering Port Phillip, and an Australian coastal vessel was trying to pass through the heads to enter into Port Phillip Bay. Signals were made, it didn't answer them, boom, a shot was fired.
Who by?
By this gun, under the direction of Commander Veal.
Commander Veal, the same bloke who'd given the order all those years previously when the shot was fired in the First World War?
Indeed. The vessel didn't answer the signals that were made to it.
So he was just having a pop at some lazy Australian sailors, basically?
He was very, very cheesed off with the way the maritime fellows were not adhering to the new requirements of signalling and answering because of the declaration of war. And he said they need to learn a lesson.
And for the next 2.5 years, it was the only shot fired in anger on Australian soil. From an Australian perspective, the Second World War, like the First, was being played out on the other side of the world. Australians were there in numbers, in Libya, Greece, Crete, Syria and Lebanon, all in defence of Mum.
The turning point in Australia's international relations can be pinned to one day and one act. The act was the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. The day was some 3 weeks later when Labour Prime Minister John Curtin gave this New Year's message. Without inhibitions of any kind, he said, "I make it clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to the traditional links and kinship with the United Kingdom."
Japan's expansionism and America's entry to the conflict were game changers. In 1942, Australia suddenly felt terribly exposed. With virtually her entire defence forces in the other side of the world, the Japanese swept through Southeast Asia virtually unopposed. It would be a short hop to invade Australia. In February 1942, Singapore plus 100,000 Allied troops fell to the Japanese. The shockwaves were felt from Broome to Bondi Beach.
It's hard to believe that this iconic Australian beach was once covered in barbed wire and metal stakes and concrete anti-tank traps and all the other paraphernalia that you need when you're trying to protect yourself from an invasion.
It was February the 19th, 1942, when the war came raining down on the northern part of Australia.
The attack came from the air. The first town to be hit was Darwin. In fact, more bombs were dropped on Darwin than on Pearl Harbor.
The air raids took a terrible toll on Darwin. 10% of its population perished.
But that was just the start. Then it was the turn of Broome, of Wyndham, of Derby in Western Australia, Townsville in Queensland. The Japanese seemed like an irresistible force. As if to prove they could attack anywhere at any time, a Japanese submarine even snuck into Sydney Harbour and torpedoed a ferry. Another sub launched shells over Bondi Beach. The shells descended upon suburbia. It was a blow to the heart of Australia. The enemy was no longer out there. It was right here. The physical damage was minimal, but the Australian psyche was rattled to the core. And it was Uncle Sam, not Mother England, who came to her aid. When the Americans finally defeated Japan in August 1945, peace returned to Australia. But the compass had shifted. Australia's isolation was dispelled by war. As the boys returned from a conflict that came to her doorstep, the young country suddenly recognised its place in the region. The Second World War had projected Australia into the heart of world affairs, but it realised it needed to stay there if it was going to develop its economy and if it was going to develop a relationship with the East which would ensure its future security. And the one man who did more than any other to bring this about was called Herbert Evatt. Eventually, he became President of the United Nations, which was an honour previous generations of Australians would have found absolutely inconceivable. Herbert Doc Evatt was one of the architects of an ideal that became the United Nations. Australia suddenly went from being a pawn to being a player at the round table when it was given a seat on the Security Council in 1946. Before the war, Australia was hardly on the world stage at all, was it?
Exactly, yes, and this was a great worry to him and worry to everybody, but it wasn't on the world stage. It was amazing, Australia, but a lot of people honestly didn't know much about it.
And eventually he became president of the United Nations.
Yes, in 1948, and that was very, very exciting because I was there, I was all of 16. He was very proud. Here he was, President of the United Nations, and he'd come from this little country, Australia. And he made Australia get on that map.
Evatt was the mouse who roared. As president, he instigated a simple yet profoundly significant act that is as important today as it was in '48, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
He felt that was terribly important, and he was a big believer in human rights for all people, doesn't matter where they came from.
When the war was over, presumably he must have had a conviction that all countries should get together again and start working for the greater good.
Yes, he did. He said they've all got to work as one. Really must. That was very, very important. You've got to discuss things. You've got to work it out. Yes, he was a great believer in that.
Evatt was a champion of civil rights, of women's rights, of workers' rights, and he was passionate about the family. And yet he's hardly discussed at all nowadays, and a lot of younger Australians that I've spoken to have never even heard of him. I think that's a real pity. In the 1950s, Australia's sense of nationhood was taking shape. It was now the Bronze Age. Sun, surf, and a confident new generation. But Australia wasn't ready to cut the umbilical cord just yet. In 1954, Elizabeth II, the Queen of Australia, came for a visit.
Now the lifesavers are going to show the Queen and the Duke what they can do, and what the Pacific surf can do to them.
She was the first reigning monarch to set foot on Australian soil. Or should I say, sand.
It's always seemed to me that in the 1950s, if the Queen was mum, then the Australians were in their late teens and were saying, we love you very much, mum, and please come and visit us whenever you want to, but it's time for us to live on our own.
Oh, not quite. Emotionally, even though the relationship with America was proceeding at pace, there was great loyalism in Australia, and most people at the start of the 50s were still had British relatives and still considered themselves Australian Britons.
The Queen was a hit, but so was the President.
As thousands wait at twilight on a spring evening of October, the President's aircraft touches down at Canberra Airport.
In 1966, with the Vietnam War escalating and Australia's involvement deepening, LBJ, President Lyndon B. Johnson, toured down under to ask Australia to give a little more.
As I look upon that uniform, with that hat turned to the side, it represents to me the highest degree of patriotism, the greatest amount of courage, and the kind of a neighbor that America always wants to have.
And Australia lapped it up. 750,000 people lined the streets of Melbourne. Close to 1 million turned out in Sydney. That's when the population was only 2 million. So, Tom, was there a deliberate decision made to turn to America?
Well, there'd always been a cultural association with America through song, movies and so on, but now it became a military and diplomatic one, and that's where a strongly independent foreign policy began.
By the late 60s and early 70s, something else was happening in Australia. Nation building continued apace on every quarter-acre block in the great suburban sprawl. Now, Australia had something that was truly, uniquely her own, the Aussie lifestyle. A decade before Scott, Charlene and Neighbours were exported to the UK, Australia's carefree way of life was already the envy of the world. Necessity, always the mother of invention, produced new icons of Australiana. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Ute, driven by another great Aussie invention, broadcaster James O'Loughlin.
Here we go.
This really is quite an extraordinary machine, isn't it?
It is a fantastic machine.
You come round the front, it looks magnificent. There's all this chrome, these great big headlights. It's a big saloon.
Tony, from the front, it is a car, but at the back, it's a truck.
It is a truck.
It is a truck.
Extraordinary.
And not only that, it's a table. And it was created because, well, multi-purposed, intensely practical. A farmer's wife wanted a car which she could drive to church on Sunday and take the pigs to market on Monday. She wrote to the head of Ford and they created. So the farmers only need one car, not two.
And it's called a ute?
It is called a ute, short for utility.
And was it successful?
It was, well, there are millions of them around. Well, I don't know if there's literally millions, but there are utes everywhere. And now, not just for farmers, but lots and lots of, particularly tradespeople, they'll have a ute and they'll drive around in it during the week, and on the weekend they'll chuckle the boogie boards in the back and go to the beach with their family.
There's something quite charming about it, isn't there? It's not high-flown, it's just very sensible, very practical.
Exactly, and a lot of Australian inventions are. They're multifunctional, they are practical. You know, we came to a harsh land and they had to be practical.
In the middle of the 70s, England's errant child grew up. But then, something happened that confronted Australians with the fact that they were still beholden to Mother England.
In 1975, the Queen of England's representative in Australia sacked the Australian Prime Minister and his government. This was a major constitutional crisis. How could the Queen have allowed it to happen? Surely the people of Australia wouldn't tolerate it.
It was like a French farce played out by three characters. The imposing and imperious Gough Whitlam, his haughty but ambitious opponent Malcolm Fraser, and Queen Elizabeth's representative, Governor-General John Kerr. He's often painted as the villain in the piece.
It must have been a fantastic time for you political cartoonists.
It was, without any shadow of a doubt, the golden age for Australian cartooning, because post-World War II, Australia was very conservative, and then along came Gough Whitlam, who was this larger-than-life, colourful character and a giant of a man. He was not like your typical Labor guy. He was this very aloof, well-read, and he was the Prime Minister of Australia from 1972. He was a kind of groovy Prime Minister, and he had no shortage of great ideas, but the problem was he wasn't very good at implementing the ideas. He might as well have run an advertising agency rather than a government. Also, one of the big platforms for him was to pull Australian troops out of Vietnam. Since World War II, Conservative governments had been constantly feeding Australian troops into conflicts like Korea and Malaya and then Vietnam. And then by the 1960s, early 1970s, people were tiring of being in war. And Whitlam's great platform was that he was going to drag the troops out. And his motto was, it's time for a change.
So who was this Queen's representative who managed to get him ditched?
Well, he's a fantastic character. This is Sir John Kerr. He was Australia's Governor-General. He was the Queen's representative in Australia. He was the cartoonist's best friend. This was Sir John Kerr. But he was an interesting character because he was such an anachronism. He was this kind of caricature of a colonial Governor-General. So cartoonists would draw him. He was ruddy-faced with a great red nose and he had curly white hair, but he would get around in a shiny top hat.
Like something out of Gilbert and Sullivan?
Very much so.
So why was Kerr able to get rid of Gough Whitlam and the Labor government?
Now we need to introduce the third character. This is Malcolm Fraser.
What was his role?
He was the leader of the opposition, but Fraser blocked Whitlam's government from getting any money because he had no faith in the Whitlam government, and this created a huge problem which pushed John Kerr into making this decision to sack Gough Whitlam's government. So all of a sudden, in the space of one day, Remembrance Day 1975, he was in, he was out, and he was vilified by the nation.
This one stroke of the pen brought Australia's relationship with Britain into question. When it counted, we, the British, were still the boss of them. 24 years later, Australians had a chance to cut the apron strings. A referendum was held. The question, should Australia become a republic? The answer, no. The Queen might not live here, but it appears the monarchy is here to stay. Canberra is a landmark to Australia's coming of age. The seat of government, the War Memorial, all pieces in the Federation jigsaw. It was built on a sheep station in the middle of nowhere because Sydney and Melbourne couldn't agree on which would be the nation's capital. But it takes more than flags and buildings to define a country. And in the 1970s, Australia was still at odds with itself.
In the steady march to nationhood, someone had been forgotten. Australia was growing up as a country, but it had forgotten its elders, the people who'd shared the custody of the country with them for the previous 200 years and who'd lived here for 40 to 60 millennia before that.
Since 1972, this makeshift embassy has been a fixture on the lawns of the old Parliament House in Canberra. It's a silent but highly visible protest against the treatment of Aborigines, who felt like strangers in their own country since 1788. Aboriginal people couldn't vote in Queensland state elections until 1965. It took a referendum in 1967 to even have Australia's indigenous people counted in the census.
What was it that was missing in the Constitution prior to 1967?
Recognition that Aboriginal people were part of the Australian population.
How were they recognised?
From the referendum of 1967, what they did was made people who owned Australia actual Australian citizens. They could be recognised legally as a citizen of Australia. Before that, they weren't. It was as though they didn't exist.
Of all the words spoken, written, then consigned to Constitution, there was one word that hadn't been uttered. Successive governments didn't dare put it on the record for fear of legal consequences. But in the year 2000, hundreds of thousands of ordinary Australians took to the streets. And then, in 2008, on his first sitting day as Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd said sorry.
We apologise, especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country, for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. Let's grasp this opportunity to craft a new future for this great land, Australia. Mr. Speaker, I commend the motion to the House.
It was just necessary, I thought, for the country, if it was going to fully embrace its future, to reconcile itself with its past.
Rolling green hills, dobbins aplenty. It's a scene British to the bootstraps. Although this isn't Dorset, it's a fox hunt in the New South Wales Southern Highlands. In this one and perhaps only respect, Australia is still more British than the British.
The irony is that in England, Scotland and Wales, fox hunting's been banned since the year 2005, but the Sydney Club are still doing pretty strong, aren't you?
Absolutely.
Still going well, and in fact they're just about to celebrate 200 years
That's correct.
of the hunt. What year did you start then?
1811. Started 1811 in Sydney.
Yeah.
And they hunted kangaroo. The Sydney Hunt Club met at Brushcutters Bay, and they hunted to the wilds of Bondi.
I'm curious, why, when fox hunting's banned in the country that started it, is it still going strong in the country that adopted it?
Here's to a very good hunt. Just be careful this morning because the grass is very long. You never know what you're going to ride into. There's wombat holes and things like that.
I'm surprised that it hasn't changed more, become more Australian. You're still wearing the reds and the white and the boots after all these years.
Well, tradition has came out of England. It's been doing it over there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Do you think there's something in it about wanting to be a bit like the British?
No. You're in Australia. Not to be like the British, but it certainly...
But you're all dressed up like a British person.
It follows, well, we speak differently, don't we?
Foxes were brought to Australia for the express purpose of hunting in 1855. Either the hunters were ordinary or the foxes were brilliant, because there are now 7 million of them running feral around the country.
So what does all this tell us about Australia? Well, the huntsmen are absolutely adamant that they don't keep doing it because they want to reclaim some romantic notion of Britishness. They say they do it because it's traditional. But what kind of tradition is it? It's a British tradition. In fact, the more I've been around Australia, the more examples I've seen of Australians relishing all sorts of different kinds of Britishness. It's not really surprising that the fingerprints of British colonialism are still everywhere to be seen around Australia. It's the same in India, New Zealand, everywhere in the Commonwealth. Look, you've got Hyde Park over there, St James's Road, Prince Albert Road, and there's Queen Victoria holding the Royal Orb. And look what I just picked up round the corner. Anyone fancy fish and chips? Here we are in the 21st century, surrounded by icons of Britishness, but clearly all these people aren't British. So what is an Aussie? Well, that really depends on where you stand and which way you look. A decade into the 21st century, there are 22 million Australians. If you were to profile an Aussie by statistics, well, she'd be 38, likely to be living in New South Wales or Victoria, and married with 1.8 children. At least one of her parents or grandparents wasn't born here. She jogs or does some other sort of routine exercise, thinks she's in okay shape, but is actually a bit overweight. She probably works in the service industry. She has sex 1.84 times a week, which she thinks isn't enough, and she'll most likely die of heart disease. But that reveals little about the patchwork quilt of culture and history that makes up modern Australia. I've clocked up tens of thousands of kilometres and several hundred years tracking the influence of so many cultures on this island continent. So what conclusion have I come to after crossing the length and breadth of Australia? Well, the big one, which is very unexpected, and I'm almost ashamed to admit it, is that by and large, I think transportation worked. That's easy for an Englishman to say from the safety of his own tall ship. Because the convicts at Port Arthur weren't crazy about the idea. Neither were the Irish, who saw themselves as political prisoners. Nor the Chinese, who weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. And then there are hundreds of Aboriginal tribes who inhabited Terra Nullius. But overall, this country is an extraordinary achievement, surviving the most arduous beginnings. And with an injection of bounty migrants, spirited and independent women, gold diggers, and wave after wave of immigrants, it's grown and prospered beyond Captain Cook's wildest dreams. And far from running from its convict past, Australia embraces it.
These seriously are 8th generation convict Australians.
What's the story then about your ancestor?
Thomas Rudd, 1787, allegedly nicks a pair of shoes and gets sent down for 7 years. But then he went back in 1795 and then reoffends. That takes serious talent. I don't know of anyone else who's actually been transported to Australia twice.
So if Australia belonged to the British in the 18th and 19th centuries and turned to America midway through the 20th, what will the Australia of the future look and sound like?
太好了，欢迎欢迎。他们采访了我，他们说那个英国广播电视台。是吗？我非常想念起哦。
You speak Mandarin?
Yeah, for my sins, yeah. China's become our #1 trading partner, so it's hugely important for the Australian economy. And where do we fit? Well, this is the neighbourhood.
Did transportation work?
Oh, for you blokes, I suppose. I think what it did in terms of the Australia of European settlement was that it produced a pretty hardy mob out here who knew that to survive it was always going to be a very basic meritocracy. Partly I think this is where the Australian sense of the fair go comes from, or fairness, is that everyone from wherever they came from deserved a decent start.
And that to me is indicative of a country that's comfortable in its own skin.
Australians today, whether they're originally from Thailand, Poland, England or Greenland, whether they're indigenous or from the other side of the world, are still affected by that same early experience. They're still part of the same culture that's made Australia so remarkable and so unique. Oh yeah, and they're still stroppy beggars. Action. This is a fantastic youth hostel, particularly if you get your foot caught in the sheets and can't get up. You could spend all the time you're being lectured, you could have your willy out.
You're a cheeky bastard.
He liked the cover that it provided.
Because, start again, please. Thanks.
Oh, wait for it. Give him a round of applause. Which is a pretty obscure royal connection, I know, but he'd used it in order... Lola was a bit... sorry, I have no idea where the camera is. So what did Governor Gibbs do?
In what way?
Sorry, it doesn't matter. I don't know either.
He had a fit of diarrhoea and several epileptic fits and died.
I've always wanted to go that way myself.
Fly.